All right, we're going to start our lecture on the respiratory system. So I'll get us rolling here and hopefully get everything finished. And I think we should be able to get this one finished in about an hour to get through the entire thing. So the cardiovascular system is going to work with the respiratory system, and together they're going to accomplish a couple of things. Number one, going to supply oxygen, okay, to the cells of the body, oxygen in our blood delivered to the cells of our body, and we need that to produce ATP, right? And then it's going to eliminate CO2 or carbon dioxide, which is toxic to cells in that it becomes produces alkalinity or acidity. All right, so if you look up here on the board, if we have too much CO2, you want to put this in your notes at the side. Too much CO2 is going to result in the formation of carbonic acid. Okay, so it makes the blood more acidic, okay, which means that it is lowering the pH. If you remember, pH of 7 is normal or neutral, right? Neutral, 7. As you go lower in number, it's more acidic, okay? If we have too much O2, on the other hand, okay, then the blood becomes alkaline, or the other term is basic, okay? So know those two things right there, and we'll talk about some of those things a little bit more in detail later on. Okay, so provides O2, eliminates CO2. Respiratory system provides for the exchange of gases, like we said, transports the gases in the blood, right, from to and from the cells of the body. It says failure of either system, our cardiovascular system or our respiratory system, results in a permanent condition that we would call death, okay, due to starvation of oxygen and accumulation of too many waste molecules if we don't get rid of the CO2, okay? Interesting thing to note, I might mention this right here. A lot of people, if you were to ask them, what's the primary reason our body breathes? And most people would say to supply oxygen to our cells, right? And that's one of the main reasons, but actually the overriding, underlying reason that we breathe is to eliminate CO2. That's even more important, although you have to do both, actually, for us to stay alive, right? In addition to functioning a gas exchange, some of the other functions of the respiratory system are listed right here. So it regulates our blood pH, which we just talked about. Contains the receptors for smell, if you remember from special senses in the roof of the nasal cavity. Filters air that we breathe in or inspire. Okay, produces sound and eliminates some water vapor and heat in exhaled air. When it's cold outside, you can actually see that, right? So if you want to specialize in the treatment of the ear, nose, and throat, all right, you would study otorhinolaryngology, right? And if you want to specifically just focus on the lungs, you would be a pulmonologist, okay? So I'm going to get rid of my picture here so we can just kind of focus on just our stuff with our blood right here, okay? Our respiratory system, if I can find my picture and recover it here. Hopefully I'll do that real quickly. There we go. Okay. Respiratory system anatomy. So let's go over the structures we see right here. Okay, so we're going to split this up. So the first part here, number 1 and number 2 are structural classification. So highlight that, put a bracket around those or something so you got that that's structural. Upper respiratory system includes the nose, the pharynx, and all the structures associated with the nose and the pharynx. Pharynx is just our throat, okay? Lower respiratory system then is going to include everything below this, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, which is plural for a bronchus, B-R-O-N-C-H-I, and the lungs. Functional classification is a little bit different. So if we go to functional classification here, we're going to split the respiratory system into 2 zones. The first one, number 1, is called the conducting zone. So the conducting zone includes all the structures that are going to conduct air into the lungs. They're going to filter, warm, and moisten the air. It would include, and you have listed there, the nose, the pharynx, the trachea, the bronchi, then the bronchioles, B-R-O-N-C-H-O-L-I-E-S, bronchioles, and then finally letter G, the terminal bronchioles. So remember, the last thing in the conducting zone are the terminal bronchioles, and then number 2 we convert to the respiratory zone or respiratory zone. That's where the gas exchange is going to occur. That includes the respiratory bronchioles, the alveolar ducts, alveolar ducts. Okay. Then we have the alveolar sacs. And then we have the individual alveoli, where the actual gas exchange takes place. And I wrote alveolar ducts up on the board, right? Without knowing that I forgot to move my picture. So there's alveolar ducts, and then we have the alveolar sacs and the alveoli. Okay? So, external anatomy of the nose. So let's go to the external portion and look at our picture here, our next picture. All right, move back one. Let's see, and I must have lost my picture there somewhere. Yep, I did. So we'll look at the external port. First, we got two major portions. You got the external nose, which for somehow I lost my picture here. So let me see if I can load that back up here. Okay, so here's our picture of our external nose. So our external nose, we have a bony framework, which includes the frontal bone, the nasal bones, as you can see in the picture here. All right, and the nasal bone, the bony framework formed by frontal bone, nasal bones, and the maxillary bones, right? And some cartilage. We have the minor and major alar cartilages right there, and then we have the septal cartilage, which we can actually see on one of our models. So if you look in your atlas, and we looked at this on page number, okay, of the big nose, or picture of the big nose. Model on the bottom of 7.2, you can actually see in blue the septal cartilage right there. Okay, it's also covered with muscle and skin, lined with a mucous membrane, and then under surface here you have your two external nares or nostrils. So let's go to our next picture here, and we'll look at this picture here. Okay, so there's the external nares, or what we just commonly call our nostrils. Those lead into a cavity here, and that cavity is known as the nasal vestibule. So the vestibule is kind of like the waiting area right here just inside your nostrils. Okay, then we have the internal nose, which we're seeing here in our image. It's a large cavity there, surrounded by bones. It's just underneath the nasal bone, superior above our mouth. Anteriorly, it's going to merge, it says, with the external nose, and posteriorly, it's going to communicate with the pharynx, or the throat, okay, by two structures here that are referred to, or the structure referred to as the internal nares right here. Okay, so that's where it communicates and leads to the pharynx, or the throat, right there. Walls have openings for ducts from the paranasal sinuses, as well as nasolacrimal ducts are going to drain into your internal nose. All right. The nose is divided into two cavities. Number two, right and left sides, by the nasal septum, which, if you remember, is primarily cartilage, but as you go posterior, the nasal septum is made up of, remember, the superior part is of the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, and the inferior part is made up by the vomer. Okay. Air flows through the nose as follows, if you go to number 3, and I think there's some tweaks we have to make with this, okay? Letter A says air enters the nostrils and is filtered by coarse hairs that line the nasal vestibule. So these are the actual hairs you see inside your nose. The air then whirls, I love that term, it whirls through the superior, middle, and inferior meatuses. So here's the meatuses. These fleshy type lobes are called the congi. The meatuses are the grooves between the congi, and I had you label that in your atlas, if you remember the video I sent you, okay? So there's a superior nasal meatus, the middle nasal meatus, and the inferior nasal meatus, and you can see those on the models on 7.2, as well as on, I believe it's a little bit later, or earlier, actually. Yeah, 7.2, top and bottom and middle pictures, you can see those, so you should label those there. Okay, air gets, you have to add this, I believe. Letter C, air comes into contact with the olfactory epithelium. If again you remember from special senses, and then it gets warmed. You have to add this. Letter D, air is warmed by blood in capillaries. We have a very rich capillary network in our nasal epithelium there, and that's why a lot of people, they just get overheated from exercise or anything like that. Sometimes they will get a nosebleed. So some people, it's very easy because of that rich capillary network right there at the epithelium. Letter E says air is moistened by mucus secreted from the goblet cells, right? And drainage from the nasolacrimal ducts, all right, as well as some sinus secretions. And then letter F says air is cleaned as mucus traps the dust particles, and the cilia, if you remember from our tissues, the cilia, pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue, is going to move the mucus with all the dust and the debris in it toward the pharynx. So it moves it backward down to the throat. Okay, so the internal or interior structures of the nose are there to perform the following three things function-wise. Okay, it says incoming air is warmed, moistened, and filtered. And number 2 says we detect olfactory stimuli. That's where our sense of smell takes place. And it says large hollow resonating chambers help modify speech sounds. And you know that because of the fact that if you get a cold and you get all congested or your sinuses are clogged up, your voice is going to sound totally different. Okay? So now let's move backward here and let's go into the throat, or what's known as the pharynx. So the pharynx or the throat is kind of a funnel-shaped tube, and you can see it's a little bit wider up here. Okay, and it kind of funnels down or narrows down as it goes this way. And we're going to split it into 3 different divisions. Okay, it's just in front or anterior to our cervical vertebrae. Okay, behind our nasal and oral cavities and above the larynx. Okay, walls composed of skeletal muscle lined with mucous membrane. And right now we still are allowing food, air to pass in here. So it says the passageway for food and for air. Provides a resonating chamber for speech sounds and houses the tonsils, which we'll look at our different tonsils that we have here showing in a little bit. Okay? So the pharynx is going to be divided into 3 main portions here. The upper part right here we're going to call the nasopharynx. So I'll get my little pencil here and we'll underline that. So there's our nasopharynx right here. So that's this region right here. Nasopharynx by the nose. So that's the superior portion. Goes from the internal nares, which we talked about right there, to the plane of the soft palate. Wall has openings for the internal nares as well as the auditory tube right there. Okay, also called the eustachian tube, right? Or the pharyngeotympanic, but let's use auditory or eustachian tubes, right? Posterior wall contains the pharyngeal tonsil, which you can see right here. So there's the pharyngeal tonsil right there. Also known as the adenoid. So anybody ever said they had to get their adenoids removed? That's what you're looking at there. Lined by ciliated epithelium, moving the mucus still inferior to where we're going to either swallow it or spit it out. Right? The intermediate part of the pharynx is called the oropharynx, okay, for oral, for mouth. So here's our oropharynx right in here. Oropharynx goes from the soft palate down to the hyoid bone, okay? So it goes all the way down to the hyoid bone, which you can see right there is your hyoid, okay? Communicates with the mouth by way of the fauces, F-A-U-C-E-S, which is right here, okay? And that's where it communicates. The mouth leads to the pharynx at the fauces. Passageway still for air, food, and for drink. And then we have a couple of different pairs of tonsils. We have the palatine tonsils, which you're going to see right here, which we don't see the palatines in any of our models. We do see the pharyngeals, okay? And underneath the tongue, you have the sublingual or the lingual tonsil, and we see those, and those are all marked in the atlas for us, okay? So we can see all of those things actually in the atlas, okay? Finally, we get to the lower portion, which is the laryngopharynx down there. Laryngopharynx, also called the hypopharynx, goes from the hyoid bone down to the esophagus on the posterior side, all right? And the larynx anterior, okay? It is both digestive and respiratory passageway still. So all of our pharynx or our throat still allows for air, food, water, okay, to actually pass through. And then we go down to the larynx, or our voice box down here. So this is our larynx as we come down to this point, okay? And there's our highlight for the larynx there. So the larynx or the voice box, okay? Short passageway goes essentially from the laryngopharynx to the trachea, so in front of C4 to C6. Don't worry about those numbers. And we have 9 pieces of cartilage that are going to make up this larynx, or this voice box. So if we go to our next picture and we look here, okay, let me erase my all my drawings here and to be able to get out of here. So here's a picture of our larynx, or our voice box, okay? So these 9 pieces of cartilage, and we do have a model in a video I showed you, a large larynx model, as well as the larynx model on some of the other ones in the atlas there. You can see some of them. So right here, you have the thyroid cartilage, which we commonly refer to as our Adam's apple, which is present in both males and females, usually larger in males because of more testosterone, all right, and growth hormone. Hyaline cartilage, highlight that, connected to the hyoid bone by this membrane right here called the thyrohyoid membrane. Okay, then sitting up from the front, you barely see it poking out from above the hyoid bone right here, but if you look at from the back side, this large leaf-shaped structure is our epiglottis. Okay, the stem is attached to the anterior part of the thyroid cartilage and the hyoid bone. And what happens here, this is a very important structure, you guys, for us. Okay, when we swallow, the larynx elevates, causing the free edge of the epiglottis to tip back and cover the glottis, which is the opening to our windpipe, essentially. Prevents food and liquids from entering the rima glottis, okay, or entering into our trachea. Right? Then you have another large piece of cartilage back here called the cricoid cartilage. It's kind of hidden here by the thyroid gland in this view, but here's the cricoid from the back side right there. Again, hyaline cartilage. All right, it's attached to the first tracheal cartilage by the cricotracheal ligament. Don't worry about that. And the cricothyroid ligament, you don't have to worry about those terms or those structures for us. Then we have 2 pieces of cartilage right here, which are kind of triangular shaped, pyramidal in shape. Those are called the arytenoid cartilages. You have one on the right, one on the left. Okay, again, hyaline cartilage. They're involved in moving the vocal folds, vocal cords, which we'll look at in a minute. On top of those, there's 2 tiny little pieces right here. These are the corniculate cartilages. So let me get my pencil and kind of highlight that. So here's the corniculate cartilage right there. It sits right on top, okay, of the arytenoids. So these are the arytenoids down here, and the corniculates sit right up on top of that. Okay, and you can see those in our models for sure. Okay. The letter F talks about the 2 cuneiform cartilages. Those cuneiforms are only seen kind of like from a side view, and we don't really get to see those very easily there. So those aren't visible on any of our models, so we don't have to really even worry about bringing those up and looking at them. Okay, I don't think, yeah, right here. These little club-shaped things right there. There's your corniculate. Or sorry, your cuneiform cartilage, right? Same term we use for our bones in our foot, right? And our ankle. Inner lining, okay, of the membrane, all right? The mucous membrane is formed into 2 pair of folds, and when we look at them this way, you can see these different folds here, okay? The upper ones, which are the fleshy or pink-colored ones right here, these are known as the ventricular folds, which are also known as the vestibular folds. That's the 2 terms, and I made that correction in the atlas. And these are actually our false vocal cords. So those come together and it closes the space between the 2 here, okay? Called the rima vestibuli, which you don't have to know that, but that closes it. Underneath them, or inferior to them in white here, you have the 2 vocal folds, which are our true vocal cords, the ones in white right there, okay? Those vibrate in response to airflow to produce sound waves, right? So the greater the pressure of the air, the louder the sound, right? Pitch is going to be controlled by the tension on the vocal cords. Think if you ever tuned a guitar string, the tighter it is, the higher the pitch, all right? And then between the folds, you have an expansion called the laryngeal sinus, or the ventricle, which you don't have to worry about that term right there for us, okay? So I'm going to show you a short little video real quickly of a laryngoscopy where somebody sticks a camera down somebody's larynx. So I'm going to pause this, pull that up, and we'll show you that. It's only about a minute or minute and a half video.
It's very soft.
So you'll notice if you can hear me during this, okay, there's the vocal cords, true vocal cords. Here's the epiglottis up in front. You can see the rings of the trachea or the windpipe when she opens up, and you can see further down, there's your rings of the trachea. Okay, that's about all of that I can usually handle. Okay, so that's about all of that video that I can usually handle. It gets a little bit crazy, all right? So we're going to move next to the trachea, all right? And in our trachea picture, which I seem to have lost that as well. So let's pause and bring that back in. So here's our picture of our trachea right here. Once we go down from the larynx, or our voice box, our next structure is the trachea. So trachea, or more commonly called our windpipe, sits anterior to the esophagus. Make sure you know that. The esophagus is behind the trachea. Goes from the larynx down to the superior border of the fifth thoracic vertebrae. So right down goes to T5. That's where the ending is, T5. And it's also, if you want to write it off to the side, about 5 inches in length. Okay. At that point, it's going to divide into the right and left primary bronchi. The inner lining of this, okay, that you're going to look at them when you look at your slides, has ciliated mucosa, which now is going to move and beat upward toward the pharynx. So it's going to move that mucus up to the pharynx so we can swallow it or spit it out. The wall of this, as you can see, these rings is made up of anywhere from 16 to 20 C-shaped pieces of hyaline cartilage. The open side faces the esophagus. Make sure you note that, okay? So, show you on this picture here, the rings are more C-shaped and the opening actually faces anterior, okay? So the esophagus, okay, can run right behind that, okay? So the open part is going to be actually posterior. Let me change that. Posterior to where the esophagus runs behind it. We're going to talk about how that expands in just a minute. Okay. The ends of each one of those C-shaped pieces of cartilage are connected by a muscle called the trachealis muscle, and you can actually see that in your atlas when you look at this histology of the trachea on 7.5. So trachealis muscle is what connects the two open parts of the C shape there. Those rings of cartilage allow for the slight expansion of the esophagus into the trachea when we swallow. Also, it keeps the trachea open all the time, or patent, P-A-T-E-N-T, patent or patent, all right? So when we swallow our food, we take the saliva and mix it into a ball, which we call a bolus, and that bolus runs down and it kind of bulges the esophagus, okay, and that open part of the C-shaped cartilage in the trachea allows for that bulge to kind of, as it goes past down, headed towards our stomach, right? Okay, then we split into the bronchi. So now we have our bronchi. Okay, at the superior border of the fifth thoracic vertebrae, we're going to divide into the right primary bronchus, into the right lung, and the left primary bronchus, into the left lung. These are also known as the main bronchus, so put that off to the side. Primary bronchus is also called the main bronchus, and when I write primary, I usually put a 1 degree sign, okay? Right primary bronchus, make sure you know this, tends to be shorter, wider, and straighter, or more vertical than the left one. Okay, so if somebody actually inhales or ingests something, a little kid, if they stick things in their mouth all the time, if they were to inhale one of those, it would most likely go into the right bronchus because it's a little straighter, all right, and wider. These are also lined with those C-shaped pieces of cartilage and lined with ciliated mucosa. At the point where we're going to divide, down here at T5, where it divides into the right and left primary bronchus, this little piece of cartilage right there is referred to as the carina, C-A-R-I-N-A. Okay? So it's kind of formed by that last tracheal cartilage there. After it enters the lungs, the primary bronchi are going to divide into secondary, or what are known as lobar bronchi. There's 3 in the right lung and there's 2 in the left lung. Important to know that. Then the secondary bronchi are going to branch into tertiary, T-E-R-T-I-A-R-Y, or what are known as segmental bronchi right here. So we got trachea, main bronchi, all right, which are the primaries, secondary or lobar, tertiary or segmental bronchi, okay? And then finally, those bronchioles, okay, they're going to turn into bronchioles. The tertiary bronchi are going to become bronchioles, which are smaller branches. And then finally into the terminal bronchioles, which is the last part of our conducting zone, if you remember that. Okay, so if we were to flip this and rotate it and turn it upside down, you would see that this would kind of resemble a tree. Here's the trunk of the tree, there's the branches, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller as they go towards the periphery of the lungs there. So that continuous branching forms what we refer to as the bronchial tree. So know that order: trachea, primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, bronchioles, terminal bronchioles. Okay? And I'll show you another picture of that in just a couple of minutes. Now, some changes histology-wise that occur as this goes on. Epithelium changes from ciliated to non-ciliated by the time we get out here into the distal bronchioles. It becomes non-ciliated. All right, the C-shaped pieces of cartilage gradually disappear. Okay, get replaced by some plates of cartilage, and as the cartilage decreases, it gets replaced by smooth muscle tissue. So as the cartilage decreases, the smooth muscle tissue increases. And then the bronchi, number 8, bronchi receive their blood from the right and left bronchial arteries and drain their blood into the right and left bronchial veins. Okay, so we'll go from there and go into our lungs and look at the lungs a little bit more. Okay, so let's use this picture of our lungs to start with. Lungs, paired cone-shaped organs that we find in our thoracic cavity. Separating the two lungs is our heart, okay, and other structures in the mediastinum. Lungs are protected and covered by a pleural membrane. So the pleura is the membrane covering the lungs. We have 2 layers to that pleural membrane. The superficial one is called the parietal pleura, which actually attaches to the wall of our thoracic cavity. The deeper one is known as the visceral pleura, okay, V-I-S-C-E-R-A-L, which is actually attached to the lungs. So just like the visceral and the parietal pericardium we had in the heart. Between them, there's a parietal cavity, and that contains a lubricating fluid. When the lungs actually move, the 2 layers, the visceral and the parietal layers, don't rub against each other, so it's there for lubrication. If there's inflammation that occurs in that pleural membrane, it's referred to as pleuritis, or sometimes just called pleurisy. That hurts quite a bit when those 2 layers rub against each other. So gross anatomy of the lungs, all right? They go from the diaphragm to just above the clavicle. You can see here's our clavicles right here. Okay, so they go just above the clavicle. They lie against the ribs, both anteriorly and posteriorly. The broader portion down here at the bottom we refer to as the base of the lung. The pointed part up here then would be the apex of the lungs. The costal surface lies against the ribs. Okay, and the mediastinal or medial surface of the lungs have a indentation to them, which you can't see on this picture, called the hilus, H-I-L-U-S. And through that hilus, and I can show you the hilus on a picture here. Here's where the hilus is located. You're going to have structures that run into and out of the lungs, right there, like blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves enter and exit the lung. Okay, on the medial surface. So let's go back here. On the medial surface of the, let me move this out of the way, okay? On the medial surface of the left lung, and you're looking at an anterior view here, medial surface of the left lung, there's a region here, an indentation. That indentation is called the cardiac notch. And that is there, obviously. The heart rests against that. If you remember when we studied our heart histology and anatomy, 2/3 of the heart lied to the left of the midline, so that's where it kind of indents into the lung right there, is at the cardiac notch. So add this to your notes there. Because of this, one of the reasons the left lung tends to be about 10% smaller than the right lung. However, in your outline on letter F, it says the right lung is thicker, broader, and shorter than the left lung. The reason for that, add this to your notes as well, is that there's a structure, a large organ right underneath your right lung, known as your liver, and that's pressing up and kind of squishing the lung down, making it a little wider, okay, and shorter. In the left lung over here, we have a oblique fissure right here. And that oblique fissure separates the superior lobe in the left lung from the inferior lobe in the left lung. But in the right lung, we're going to have two fissures because we have three lobes in the right lung. So it says in the right lung, the upper part, here's the oblique fissure right here. It says the upper part of the oblique fissure right here, okay, separates the superior lobe from the inferior lobe. But the lower part of the oblique fissure, okay, is going to separate the inferior lobe from the middle lobe. And then our second fissure, which we call our horizontal or sometimes called the transverse fissure, subdivides the superior lobe from the middle lobe. Okay, so we have three lobes in the right lung. We have two lobes in the left lung. That's why we have two lobar bronchi in the left side, and we have three lobar or secondary bronchi on the right side. Okay. So it says in here, once again, each lobe receives its own secondary or lobar bronchus. The right primary bronchus divides into a superior, middle, and inferior bronchus. Okay, left primary bronchus divides just into a superior and an inferior secondary or lobar bronchi. And then as it talks about here as we move on and we look at this picture here, so here's our trachea, there's our primary bronchus, here's our secondary on the left, there's our secondary, three of them on the right. Okay, and then that's going to divide into in each lung secondary bronchi branch into the 10 tertiary, right, or segmental bronchi. These are the colored and numbered ones right here. Okay, so if you look in the atlas, make sure you label those because I went over it in the atlas how you're supposed to label those tertiary bronchi. Okay, and those supply air to the bronchopulmonary segments of the lungs. Okay. So under lobules and alveoli, now we go a little bit closer and we're going to go to the microscopic view of everything here. So in your atlas, you might want to look at the model on 7.7. So we just went over the model on 7.6 kind of when we talked about the bronchi. So each bronchopulmonary segment has small compartments called lobules, okay? And you're seeing a portion of a lobule of the lung right there. Each lobule is going to be wrapped in elastic connective tissue, contains a lymphatic vessel, okay, which is in green in your atlas when I went over that model. Make sure you know that, okay? And in the atlas, we labeled that, okay? You got a lymphatic vessel, an arteriole, which you're going to remember is going to be blue, a venule, which in this case is going to be red, and a branch of a terminal bronchiole called a respiratory bronchiole. So here's the terminal bronchiole becoming the respiratory bronchiole. Okay. A respiratory bronchiole then is going to subdivide into several alveolar ducts, and these are the alveolar ducts right here. Around the circumference of the alveolar ducts are numerous alveoli. Those are the individual little grape-like looking structures here, and a group of them collected together is known as an alveolar sac. Okay, so alveoli and alveolar sacs. So an alveolus itself, okay, an alveoli is plural, so an alveolus kind of is a cup-shaped little outpouching. It's like I said, the little grape-like looking structure. It's lined with simple squamous epithelial tissue and has an elastic membrane around it so it can expand and recoil. Alveolar sacs are two or more alveoli that share a common opening. That's what makes a sac, two or more alveoli. So we got a couple of different types of cells. So if you're looking at your atlas on 7.7, and you're looking at the picture on the bottom there of the individual alveoli, you're going to see there's two different types of cells. Type 1 alveolar cells are just simple squamous epithelial cells. That's what the majority of the cells in your lungs are going to be made up of. Okay, they form the most of the lining of the alveolar wall where the gas exchange occurs. So gas exchange occurs there, exchanging O2 for CO2, right? The second type is called type 2 alveolar cells or septal cells, and you'll see those are kind of a brown looking structure right in the center of those in your atlas on 7.7. Okay, they secrete alveolar fluid, and the purpose of that fluid is to keep those cells moist. What it does, it contains something called a surfactant, S-U-R-F-A-C-T-A-N-T, which lowers the surface tension, which keeps the alveoli from collapsing between breaths. Okay, so one of the things that happen when babies are born prematurely, if they're born too soon, they don't have that surfactant made, and it causes them not to be able to breathe on their own. So a lot of times babies, if they're premature, have to use ventilators to help them be able to breathe until they mature enough and those alveoli are producing the surfactant. Okay, so you can cross out E and F in your outline. Letter G says around the alveoli, the lobules, arterial, and venules are connected by a capillary network, and you see those capillaries listed on the model on the top of 7.7 there, as well as with the elastic tissue that you can also see in there. Letter H says the exchange of respiratory gases between the air spaces in the lungs and the blood occurs by diffusion across a respiratory membrane. All right, you don't have to worry about the layers, so you can cross out all that 1 through 4 underneath that and the letter 5. And you can also just review that on number 7, blood nerve supply to the lungs. You don't have to know the nerve supply, letter E, but there's a double blood supply to the lungs, okay? Remember when we went through our tracing at the very beginning of the heart, we talk about deoxygenated blood, okay, coming from the pulmonary arteries. It gets oxygenated and comes back into the heart by the pulmonary veins. Okay, but oxygenated blood is delivered to the bronchi and the bronchioles by the bronchial arteries and drained by the bronchial veins. So now we have to go into the mechanics of pulmonary ventilation or breathing. So this one's a little bit more, and let me show you this picture here real quickly. This is what you'll look at in your slides in the histology on 7.8 and 7.9. So this is really the primary part I want you to see. So if we trace it back, it's easier to almost go backward. These little structures here are the individual alveoli. 2 or more of them, like you see here, that share a common opening. These are the alveolar sacs. The sacs lead to the alveolar ducts, okay, which leads to the respiratory bronchioles right here. And then those become terminal bronchioles. And where you see the difference is the terminal bronchioles are made of cuboidal tissue, cuboidal epithelial tissue, so they appear a little thicker and a little darker than the respiratory bronchioles there, okay? So back to the mechanics of ventilation here, all right? Mechanics of ventilation. Exchange of gases between the atmosphere, the blood, and the cells, we collectively just refer to it as respiration. There's 3 processes occurring in respiration. So a lot of this is physiology, but we have to cover this so you're ready to handle it when you get to physio. Number 1, pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary ventilation, or simply breathing, includes 2 parts: inspiration, or inhaling, and expiration, or exhaling of air between the lungs and the atmosphere. Number 2, we have external or pulmonary respiration. It exchanges gases between the air spaces in the lungs and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries. So the blood's gaining O2 and losing CO2. So think of it this way. We're taking air from the outside, external. We're bringing it into the lungs. That's where we're putting oxygen into the bloodstream in our lungs. And then number 3, the internal or tissue respiration, what happens when that blood's delivered to the tissues in our body. Okay, so it's the exchange of gases between blood and the capillaries and the body cells. So the blood loses O2, drops it off there, and gains CO2. So just know the basics of each one of those things. So now we have to talk about kind of what happens and how we breathe. And a lot of times I like to talk about this with people. They think, well, you breathe because you suck air in and you blow air out. But breathing is a lot more complicated than that. Breathing is essentially follows a lot of the laws that you learned in chemistry. For those of you who had chemistry already, or at least even in high school chemistry, you should have covered the gas laws with volume and pressure. So we're going to kind of talk about that as we go through this, all right? So inhalation or inspiration, number 2, process of moving air into the lungs is taking a breath in, right? And the way that occurs is when air pressure in the alveoli of the lungs, which we call alveolar pressure, is lower than the atmospheric pressure. So remember, gases flow from high pressure to low pressure systems. All right. So think of it this way. All right. And I'm going to bring myself into the picture so I can try to explain this to you while I'm looking at it. Okay. Go to your gas laws. And you talked about the gas laws, and one of the primary gas laws in chemistry was Boyle's law. It had to deal with pressure and volume. So if I have a container of a gas and I have a certain number of molecules of a gas in that container and I keep the molecules the same, but I increase the size of the container, it decreases the pressure, because the pressure is all based on how many collisions there are with the wall of the container. If I have that same container, if I decrease the size of the container, I'm going to have more collisions by those molecules. So decreasing the size increases the pressure. So they're inversely related in that regard. Okay. So if in inhalation, if I have a lower pressure inside my lungs than outside, air is going to rush into my lungs. Okay, so it's achieved by, number 3, expanding the lungs, right, which increases the volume of the lungs. If I take a breath in, I contract the muscles of inspiration, which we're going to talk in here. Number 4 are listed. Number 1 is the diaphragm, right, and number 2 are the external intercostals. Make sure you know those. Muscles of inspiration. So when I take a breath in, the diaphragm flattens out, the thoracic cavity increases. So I just increased the size of my container, which meant that the pressure went down. The pressure is lower now inside my lungs than outside, so air is going to rush into my lungs when that happens. Okay. So under number 4, letter B, after the external intercostals, it says contracting these muscles increases the volume of the thoracic cavity, which then, next bullet point, says that lowers the pressure, right? And the increase in the volume of the lungs, number 5, causes a decrease in pressure. Therefore, air rushes down the pressure gradient from the atmosphere into the lungs. And inspiration ends when the pressure difference is eliminated or we reach what's called equilibrium, right? It does say in number 7, sometimes if we have forceful inspiration, right, taking a deep breath in, we're going to incorporate the scalene muscles as well when we do that, okay? So it's all based on Boyle's law with pressure and volume. You increase the size of the container, the pressure goes down, and gases rush from high pressure, move from high pressure to low pressure system. So exhaling is going to be almost the opposite. Exhaling or expiration is the process of moving the air out of the lungs. It occurs when the air pressure in the lungs is greater than the pressure outside in the atmosphere. Now, it says, unlike inspiration, normal expiration is a passive process because no muscular contractions are involved. So you want to add in there, that means inspiration is an active process. You contract muscles. But because we have elastic tissue covering our lungs, when those muscles of inspiration relax, the lungs recoil, okay, which decreases the size of the container, increasing the pressure then, and it goes to number 4 in your outline. Relaxing the inspiratory muscles decreases the volume in the thoracic cavity due to recoil of the elastic fibers that got stretched, and the inward pull of surface tension because of that alveolar fluid. Number 5 says that it decreases the lung volume, which in turn increases alveolar pressure. Therefore, air rushes down the pressure gradient from the alveoli into the atmosphere. If we have forceful expiration, say, for instance, you're having a baby or you're blowing up a balloon or something like that, then we're going to incorporate the abdominal muscles and the internal intercostal muscles as well. And then number 8 says respirations can be used for things other than normal breathing, and these are referred as to modified respiratory movements. Things listed there include laughing, sobbing, sneezing, coughing, talking, etc. So a couple things just to write down here. You can add yawning and hiccups to that list as well. A couple things you want to write down and make sure you know. Sneezing clears the upper respiratory passages, whereas coughing clears the lower respiratory passages. And then let's jump to a couple of different terms here that I want to make sure you're aware of, so write these in your notes here. Our term for normal breathing is eupnea, E-U-P-N-E-A, means normal breathing. Dyspnea is difficulty breathing, and apnea is stoppage or cessation of breathing. Okay, make sure you know those terms there. Okay, the role of respiratory center. We're going to just cover this real quickly, just a couple different things here. Respiratory muscles are controlled automatically by the respiratory center, which is in the brainstem. So if you remember a little bit from our last section when we covered the nervous system and the brain, there's 3 main areas, and the only ones I want you to know here: A, the medullary rhythmicity area, Medullary gives it away. It's found in the medulla oblongata, and it controls the basic rhythm of respiration. That's all you need to know. So the name tells you, medullary rhythmicity area, the rhythm of breathing, okay, is in the medulla, and normally that's anywhere from 12 to 16 respirations per minute. Write that down. 12 to 16 is normal. Letter B, the pneumotaxic area, okay, is found in the pons. That helps coordinate transition between inspiration and expiration. In other words, when you breathe, how long do you breathe in before you breathe out? That's controlled automatically in the pons. And remember, the pons and the medulla were the two main parts of the brainstem that controlled respiration for us. And then finally, letter C is the apneustic area, like apnea, right? Apneustic area, located in the pons as well. First part does the same thing as above, coordinate transition between inspiration and expiration. But the second bullet point here says it stimulates the inspiratory area to prolong inspiration, therefore inhibiting expiration. So if you know somebody that has sleep apnea, what happens in sleep apnea? Well, people will be, sleeping, they'll be snoring or whatever, and they'll take a breath in, and they won't breathe out. Okay, my dad had sleep apnea really bad. My mom would stay awake half the night, and when she heard him take that breath in and stop breathing, she'd have to jab him in the ribs and get him to start breathing again. So that's what the apneustic area does. It kind of inhibits the expiration. Regulation of the respiratory center. The only thing you need to know here, there's some cortical influence. Cerebral cortex allows for voluntary control of breathing to a normal extent. Now, most breathing is autonomic or automatic. We don't have to think about it. It's just going to occur naturally. But there is a term, and that term that you have to know here or write down is called volition. Volition is conscious control of breathing. So we can consciously control our rate of breathing if we want to. We can breathe faster if we want. We can breathe slower if we want. But it's only to a limited extent. And I always like to joke around that little kids a lot of times say they're going to hold their breath till they die when they throw a temper tantrum. Anytime one of your kids says they're going to do that, I always say, tell them to hold on a second so you can get your phone and you can video the whole thing, right? And then tell them to go. Go ahead and start, because you can't hold your breath until you die. All right. Now that doesn't mean throw them in a swimming pool, all right, with a brick under their leg or something like that, or don't put a plastic bag over your head. That's totally different. But we can't just hold our breath until we die. The reflex for survival is going to overcome that. Letter B says there's some chemical stimuli there, which allow us to take in more or less oxygen or more or less CO2, depending on to balance the pH of our body. And letter C, there's something called the inflation or the Herring-Brewer reflex, which is a protective reflex. It's regulated by stretch receptors in our lungs that prevent us from overinflating the lungs. If you overinflate a balloon, it's going to pop. If you were to overinflate your lungs, the alveoli would pop or rupture. So we have a stretch reflex or the Herring-Brewer reflex, which keeps us from overventilating our lungs. Okay. Letter E talks about exercise of the respiratory system real quickly. So we know that obviously exercise, we increase our cardiac output and blood flow through the lungs increases. So blood picks up more O2 and releases more CO2 in there. So the rate of pulmonary ventilation increases when we do that. So it's good for our respiratory system as well. Number 4 says at the end of an exercise session, then pulmonary ventilation returns to the resting level. Okay. Under aging in the respiratory system, there's a few facts there we want to list. Okay, effects of aging on the pulmonary system would include decreased elasticity, and the lungs also, with the loss of elasticity, are going to become more rigid, as will the chest wall. There's a decrease in the lung capacity and the vital capacity, which you'll cover those numbers in physiology. Oxygen concentration tends to decrease, and the macrophages involved with the alveoli aren't quite as active as well. Cilia slows down as well in the respiratory mucosa, and because of that, elderly people become more susceptible to things like pneumonia, bronchitis, emphysema, and some other pulmonary disorders. Okay? So under key medical terms, I want to go over a couple things. I'm going to keep this really, really simple today as we finish out here for our respiratory system. Okay, and some of this stuff you can look up on your own, but I do want you to know some of the basics of this. So I'm going to use my whiteboard as much as I can here and try to get as much of it in the picture as possible. Okay. So under key medical terms, let's talk about a couple of different things. All right. First of all, I want to talk about COPD. So COPD. Okay. Stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disorders or diseases. Okay. Most people say disorders. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disorders. There's two main ones of these. So first of all, they are, first one is chronic bronchitis, and the second one is emphysema. Okay, so a couple of things, first of all, that they have in common. Okay, a couple of things that they have in common, right? In common, these things have a history. Most of people have a history of smoking. Okay, they have dyspnea, difficulty breathing. They may have a cough, and they may have frequent infections, lung infections or respiratory system infections. Okay, so frequent infections. So those are things in common with both types. The difference between the two, primarily, with chronic bronchitis, they have increased buildup of mucus. And when that mucus builds up, okay, and gets in the alveoli, it kind of blocks the passage of O2 and CO2. So they can't get air in very easily there, okay? There's a lot of infections due to the fact that air is not exchanged there very easily, and they tend to get cyanotic. If you remember our terms from way back when we did integumentary system, cyanosis is they kind of turn blue. So there's a nickname for people given with chronic bronchitis, and it's in every textbook around. People with chronic bronchitis are sometimes referred to as blue bloaters. Okay, because they kind of bloat up a little bit and they have that cyanotic color, that blue color. Okay? People with emphysema, on the other hand, are a little bit different. Okay, they have a decreased elasticity of lung tissue. So the lungs expand real easily, but they don't recoil. So we can get plenty of air in, they just can't get the air out. So it's forcefully has to be pushed out or exhaled out. Okay, so with people with emphysema, they have a nice pink color to them because they have plenty of oxygen in, but they have to forcefully exhale the air out or kind of puff when they exhale. So they're known as pink puffers. Okay, so I remember the first time I heard of this lecture coming up from when I was in college, and the guy talked about, well, tomorrow we'll talk about pink puffers and blue bloaters, and I thought he made these terms up, but they're in every textbook. That's the terms given to these people with COPD. Okay, also people with emphysema, because the fact that they're expanded their chests a lot of the times, people say or refer to them as being barrel chested, like a wheelbarrow, right? Okay, or a barrel full of monkeys, right? So barrel chested, right? Because they're expanded. Although I do know some people who have emphysema and they are super small. They're not barrel chested at all. Okay. Last thing we want to mention here before we're done, and again, we could spend a lot more time on all these different things, and we just don't have the time to put into covering each one of them. I want to talk real quickly a little bit about lung cancer. So for lung cancer, all right, write down that 85% of cases are related to smoking. And it's not good when anybody gets lung cancer, but I think one of the most tragic things is when somebody who's never smoked in their life gets lung cancer. I think that's even more tragic for some reason, all right? It's 10 to 30 times more common in smokers than in non-smokers. There's 3 main different types here, and you can look those up and read about them if you want. I'm not going to ask you anything about them, like bronchogenic carcinoma, things like that is the most common. But I do want you to know this. There is a 10 to 15%, people that have lung cancer, a 10 to 15% 1-year survival rate. And what that means is if you have 100 people in a room and they're all diagnosed on a single day with lung cancer in 1 year, there's only going to be 10 to 15 of them that survive. Reason for that is it isn't typically diagnosed until later in the disease, which creates a lot of problem in regards to being able to overcome that and to survive it, okay, more than a year. Let's see, I have one other term I want to write up here in case I was to ask you something about it. Okay, 2 terms actually. Okay, the terms would be atelectasis and pneumothorax. Okay, so atelectasis actually means lung collapse. So that's what atelectasis is. It's collapsing of the lung, usually caused by pneumothorax, which leads to collapsing of the lung. So in other words, somebody gets impaled with something into their thoracic cage, and it breaks through the pleural lining, the negative pressure space there. It allows the outside pressure to reach the same as the inside pressure, which causes the lung to collapse. So they usually have to put a chest tube in to reinflate the lung, that sort of thing. So it can be caused by being a knife wound, even a fractured rib can sometimes puncture the lung, leading to pneumothorax or atelectasis. So they're kind of used interchangeably, those terms. Technically, there is a little bit of a difference, but most people use them interchangeably there. Okay, so that's it for this chapter on respiratory system. And we're all caught up, ready to take the next exam from here on out. So I think from here we go into digestive system, which we will talk about next week. Okay, so that's it.